Okay, so we are understanding the unit 2 of designing an Azure compute solution for the exam AZ305. Okay, so so how it begins is, first it talks about, if you go through it, right, you will see first it talks about choosing an Azure compute service. What do you think is a compute? I mean, for a very long time I had a huge doubt. What do you mean when you say that, okay, this is the compute infrastructure or compute side of Azure? So the answer to this is that when you're talking about the compute side of the Azure setup, it's basically the hardware and the software that you're going to be using as part of your infrastructure. So when I say, okay, what is my compute, what do you mean when you say that, okay, I want to figure out what my compute services will be for Azure? It basically means you're going to figure out what kind of hardware that you would be selecting for your Azure setup and what kind of software that you would be using. Okay, and there could be like multiple Azure compute services that are available, but the ones that AZ305 takes us through are Azure virtual machines, batch services, app service, functions, logic app, container instances, and Kubernetes service. And all of these services, if you look deeper into it, they all have different purpose for it. Okay, so for example, if I say, okay, I don't care that I chose Azure as my as my buddy or as my collaborator firm for deciding on for moving out my applications. I don't care about that. I want full control of what I am building, and I want full control of the hardware or the software that I would be building on, and I would want to change whatever or however I would want things to be. In that cases, you would go for an Azure virtual machine because it provides you with an entire you get the access to this to the entire system in case of Azure virtual machines. But in case of Azure virtual machine, how it is, so what happens is, say for example, you say, okay, I need a 16 GB computer and I need it to have, say for example, MacBook Macintosh OS, or I want a 16 GB computer which has 1 terabyte of this, and I want it of Microsoft operating system 10, and I want that. What happens is, say for example, you want to say no, but now my requirements have changed and now I want a 64 GB. So in that case, what will happen is that either you will create two 132 GB, 116 GB of another system, or what you're going to do is, like, basically you're going to scale up. You just keep on adding more virtual machines as and when your new requirements increase. And in that case, what happens is you have a lot of, because first of all you are having an access of it entirely. In times when your requirement increases, what you're basically doing is you're accumulating more and more of virtual machines that you need to take care of. It's good when you know that your requirement will not go beyond 16 GB or maybe beyond 32 or a 64 GB system. But what if your application is such that it scales up at a very large or at a very high at a high speed? In those circumstances, Azure provides you another compute service which is known as an Azure batch service. It is used, basically, if you read also, it's basically used to run large scale parallel and high performance computing applications. So in this case, what happens is you can scale up and do whatever things you want to do with Azure batch. Okay, then you have one set of compute service which is known as Azure App Service, and this is the application that is used when you want to host your web applications or your mobile backends or your RESTful APIs. There are two other applications that are also available, which is Azure Container Instances and Azure Kubernetes Service, which do the same. You are basically hosting your website or applications in all three of them. The difference, however, is between whether you want to host your entire website along with its front end, back end, and storage into one system, or do you want to separate it, right? So if it's a monolithic kind of a situation where you want all of it in one machine and in all of that, you go for Azure Web Service. But say for example, you say, no, I don't give a damn, I want containered I want it in a container manner, wherein you have, okay, one container for your storage, then you have one container for your backend, one end container for your front end. You're dividing your application. In those cases, we have two. One is Azure Container Instances, and then the other is Azure Kubernetes Service. So those are the two compute services that are provided. Okay, and then we have our Azure Functions and Logic Apps. So if you think about it, they are kind of in a way similar to Azure virtual machines or batch services, but they are like the lighter version of it, like how the lighter version of app services, a container, the container instances. So in case of Azure Functions or in case of Azure Logic App, what happens is you say, listen, I don't want the entire control, I don't want anything of your system, I just want something which runs this codes, gives me the output, and I'm able to process it. In those cases, you have Azure Functions and Logic Apps. Both of them are quite similar. Difference being Azure Function is more code oriented. You write down your code and you run it. And then in case of Azure Logic Apps, what happens is it's more of a UI based. If you create a Logic App where you want to send a Logic App, where you want to send an email, you have like how do I say? You basically have your workflows getting created. There's a drag and drop service that you do in case of Azure Logic Apps, and that's what it's talking about in the initial things of it. And then the unit talks about basically what are the see, one thing is you have these many things, compute services that are present over there. The next thing is how do you decide which one you want to go for. Okay, and to decide on to which one you go for, Azure provides you certain parameters that it has created, or certain help books that it has created. It says that when you're deciding on which instance of Azure compute service you want to create, you decide on there are different parameters. One is control, the other is workload, and the third is architecture. Okay, if you say that, okay, I want like you decide whether you want full control or you're just wanting to run a code. So if you want full control, you will be going for Azure virtual machine. You say, I don't give a damn about control, just run my code. You would go for an Azure function. And then it talks about what kind of workload that you would be wanting to run. So for example, if there's a application of yours wherein there's a lot of workload, first of all there's high workload. It's a continuous workload, or it's an event based workload. So if it's a continuous workload, you're going to decide between a virtual machine or a batch service, depending on what level of workload it is, whether it's going to extend, or how we talked about in case of virtual machine versus batch. And and the second thing you have to check is whether it's an event driven. So for example, I don't want my email applications to be running 24/7. I don't want my code of Python, which is basically sending out an email, to always run. I want it to run only when either there's a failure that has happened or there's a success that has happened. In that case, it's more event driven. So in that case, what I'm going to do is I would be running that piece of code in Azure function. But then there is a piece of code that is basically my front end of the website. I want it up and running 24/7. I would rather have it created on my virtual machine or my batch service, depending on the kind of application that I have. So the next thing is workload. And then there is the difference of the architecture. So basically you are going to think about like, okay, I have a website, I want to host it in Azure, but my website is more monolithic, wherein my front end, back end, and storage is present on one system. So I'm going to probably use Azure App Service. But there is someone who says, okay, no, I have a microservice kind of architecture where I want my front end to be running on a different machine, back end to be on other storage on. So then you have a container. Okay, and then depending upon whether it's more like, okay, my backend is, I don't want to move my backend to Azure, I just want my storage. So then you would use a container instance rather than Azure Kubernetes service, which is basically all of it. So these are the different parameters that you use when you want to decide like what kind of Azure compute service you're using. Okay, and then Azure also tries, like Microsoft documentation also tries to help you in deciding what kind of compute service you're going to use when you're migrating from from your on premises. Say for example you are doing a movement wherein you are saying that okay, no, I want my application to be more cloud optimized. You're going to then choose an application which is more cloud optimized, probably an Azure virtual machine or maybe Azure batch service. If it's more of a lift and shift wherein you say no, I don't want anything of that, I just want see, basically if it's cloud optimized, it's going to be Azure batch service. But if it's not cloud optimized and you want just a lift and shift, you say okay, I have these many virtual machines that I had created earlier, I had these many systems, I want to move those systems into cloud. It's just a lift and shift. You're going to go for either Azure virtual machine or Azure web service, depending on which way you go for. And then you decide based also, like, whether when you're moving your application it's going to be a containerized application or how it's going to be. So those are the few parameters that you decide on. Then it talks about hosting. So hosting is basically Azure providing you different options. It says, hey, there are 3 options that I have. One is where I'm just giving you control of everything, that's your infrastructure as a service. The other is where it says that okay, infrastructure is on my hand, but the platform and all the things that go ahead, it's on you. Then it's a platform as a service. If you say no, I don't care about the platform or the infrastructure, I want just the resources, then it's a function as a service. Infrastructure as a service basically is the example of it would be a virtual machine, wherein you have created a virtual machine, and then after that whatever happens to that virtual machine is your responsibility. What the networking capabilities of that virtual machine is what you are going to take care of. The security of that virtual machine is what you are going to take care of. In case of platform as a service, which is basically your Azure web services or app services or Kubernetes services, all of those, wherein the infrastructure is also Azure's responsibility. Also the networking capabilities or the networking strengthening security and all of those also fall under the responsibilities of Azure. What you are going to do is you're just running your app on the hosting environment that has been provided to you, right? You don't bother about the networking. Then the third is your function as a service, wherein you're not even bothered about, like how we earlier said, you're not going to be bothered about what platform it's being run on, what hosting environment it's using, any of that. All you want is that your code to run. Those are your Azure functions and Azure logic apps. So these are the 3 things that are present, right? Like the application also, like for example in function as a, so if you have to like differentiate between all of this, in IaaS it's the infrastructure is Azure's responsibility. After that, what's the operating system runtime, what the applications, data, functions, everything is your responsibility. In case of platform as a service, the infrastructure, operating system and the runtime is the responsibility of Azure, but the application, the website that it is going to run and all of that is your responsibility. In case of function as a service, even the application is the responsibility of Azure. Like for example Python, if you want to run a Python code, installing of that Python on that or JavaScript on that, it's all Azure's responsibility. Making sure that the Python is up and running and everything, it's their responsibility. So function as a service basically just says, don't even worry about the application, we are going to take care of it, you just run the code. That is Azure Logic App and Azure Functions. Okay. If you scroll down through below, there's a very beautiful flowchart that Microsoft has also provided, which will help you in understanding in understanding what we have been talking about. How it goes is, for the completion of this video we'll go through it. So what it says, it's that okay, fine, if you want to migrate your application and it's more of a lift and shift kind of situation, you decide whether the application that you are lifting and shifting, whether it's whether you want to host it on a web service or it's going to be on an app service or it's going to be on a virtual machine. So probably if it's a website or anything, it's going to be an app service. Otherwise it's going to be your databases and everything, they usually go into your virtual machine. Okay. If it's a lift and shift, if you go back and you say, can my lift and shift application be containerized? If it cannot be, it's going to be either app service or virtual machine. Okay. If it can be containerized, it's going to be either container instances or Azure Kubernetes service, depending upon whether how you choose to be. For example, if there's a website and you want the backend to code be with you, just the storage, you're going to go for container instances. If you want to utilize all of the Azure containers, then you're going to go for Azure Kubernetes service. Okay, so if you're doing a migration where it's just a lift and shift, there are two options. One is whether it's containerized or whether it's not containerized. If it's containerized, you have two options. One is your Azure Kubernetes service or your container instances. If it's not containerized, it's going to be either Azure Web Services or Azure Virtual Machines. Okay, if you are migrating and you want it to be cloud optimized, you're going to move it to Azure Batch Services, and you want kind of control over the services that you're creating. If you're building it completely new, it depends upon whether you want a full control or not. So if you want a full control, basically it's going to be virtual machine. Anytime you want full control of your infrastructure, it's going to be an Azure virtual machine. If you don't want full control, you want it to be more stronger, it's going to be Azure Batch Service. If it's a website which is a full, it's a microservice architecture, it's basically your it's a website that you want to run or an application that you want to run, it's going to be an app service. If it's going to be an event driven, it's going to be Azure Functions Logic App. If you want it to be in forms of containers, it's going to be container instances or Azure Kubernetes service. And like, to summarize it, all of these services in the simplest form, if I would say, okay, I'm building a new application, I want full control of the infrastructure that I'm having, I go for Azure Virtual Machine. I say, no, I don't want full control, but I want that since it's beginning of my application, it's going to scale up fast, I would go for an Azure Batch Service. If I say, okay, no, I'm not hosting my entire web application, or I'm not hosting my entire code or anything in Azure, I just want few codes that just run on Azure and just want the results, I would go for an Azure Functions or an Azure Logic App. I would be using either of them. If I say, okay, no, I want my applications that I'm moving or I'm creating, they are containerized, I would rather go for container instances or Azure Kubernetes. Depending upon whether I want the whole of the website to be containerized in Azure, then it's going to be Azure Kubernetes services. If I want just part of my website to be containerized, I'm going to go for container instances. If I'm doing a lift and shift kind of a situation and my website is not containerized, I would either go for Azure Web Services or Azure Virtual Machines, depending on which way I would want to go. So these are the compute services that are there, and you can choose to decide on which way you would want to go. And that's pretty much about it. We would be going into details of Azure Virtual Machines, Kubernetes Service, Batch Services, Functions, and all of them in the later sections of the post. And I hope whatever this is, this video has helped you in some ways in understanding. So that's it. Thank you so much.